Ladies and gentlemen, Lapa, welcome to each and every one of you to Harry's Deepenings, where we continue our study of some answered questions. So we are now moving on to chapter 10, which is entitled Rational Proofs and Traditional Arguments from the Sacred Scriptures. Today at table, let us speak a little of proofs. Had you come to this blessed spot in the days of the manifestation of that most resplendent light, entered the court of his presence, and beheld his luminous countenance, you would have recognized that his utterance and his beauty were in want of no further proof. How numerous the souls who, upon attaining his presence, became at once confirmed believers, dispensing with any further proof. Even those who were steeped in the deepest hatred and denial would, upon meeting Baha'u'llah, testify to his greatness, saying, "This is indeed a distinguished man, but how regrettable that he makes such a claim, for whatever else he might say would be acceptable." Now, since the luminary of truth has set, all stand in need of proofs, and so we have been occupied with providing rational proofs. Let us mention another, and this undeniable proof should alone suffice any fair-minded soul. It is that this illustrious being advanced his cause from within the most great prison, whence his light shone forth, his fame encircled the globe, and the word of his glory reached both east and west. To this day, such a thing has never come to pass, if the matter be examined with fairness. But there are certain souls who, even if they were to hear every proof in the world, would not judge fairly. Governments and peoples, with all their might, fail to resist him, while he, alone and single-handed, wronged and imprisoned, accomplished whatsoever he had purposed. I will not mention the miracles of Baha'u'llah, for the hearer might say that these are merely traditions which may or may not be true. Such too is the case with the Gospel, where the accounts of the miracles of Christ come down to us from the apostles and not from other observers, and are denied by the Jews. Were I, nonetheless, to mention the supernatural feats of Baha'u'llah, they are numerous and unequivocally acknowledged in the East, even by some of the non-believers. But these accounts cannot be a decisive proof and testimony for all, since the hearer might say that they are not factually true, as the followers of other denominations also recount miracles from their leaders. For instance, Hindus recount certain miracles of Brahma. How can we know that those are false and that these are true? If these are reported accounts, so too are those. If these are widely attested, then the same holds true of those. Thus, such accounts do not constitute a sufficient proof. Of course, a miracle may be a proof for the eyewitness, but even when he might not be sure whether what he beheld was a true miracle or mere sorcery. Indeed, extraordinary feats have also been attributed to certain magicians. In brief, our meaning is that many marvelous things appeared from Baha'u'llah, but we do not recount them. For not only do they not constitute a proof and testimony for all mankind, but they are not even a decisive proof for those who witness them and who may ascribe them to magic. Moreover, most of the miracles attributed to the prophets have an inner meaning. For instance, it is recorded in the Gospel that upon the martyrdom of Christ, darkness fell, the earth shook, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, and the dead arose from their graves. If this had outwardly come to pass, it would have been a stupendous thing. Such an event would have undoubtedly been recorded in the chronicles of the time and would have seized with dismay the hearts of men. At the very least, the soldiers would have removed Christ from the cross or would have fled. But as these events have not been recorded in any history, it is evident that they are not to be understood literally, but according to their inner meaning. Our purpose is not to deny, but merely to say that these accounts do not constitute a decisive proof, and that they have an inner meaning, nothing more. Accordingly, today at table we will refer to explanations of traditional arguments drawn from the sacred scriptures. For all that we have spoken of thus far have been rational arguments. Since this is the station of searching after truth and seeking the knowledge of the real, that station wherein the sore athirst longs for the waters of life and the struggling fish reaches the sea, wherein the ailing soul seeks the true physician and partakes of divine healing, wherein the lost caravan finds the path of truth and the aimless and wandering ship attains the shore of salvation. The seeker must therefore be endowed with certain attributes. First, he must be fair-minded and detached from all save God. His heart must be entirely directed towards the supreme horizon and freed from the bondage of vain and selfish desires, for these are obstacles on the path. Furthermore, he must endure every tribulation, embody the utmost purity and sanctity, and renounce the love or hatred of all the peoples of the world, lest his love for one thing hinder him from investigating another, or his hatred for something prevent him from discerning its truth. This is the station of search, and the seeker must be endowed with these qualities and attributes. That is, until he attains this station, it will be impossible for him to gain the knowledge of the Son of Truth. Let us return to our theme. All the peoples of the world are awaiting two manifestations, who must be contemporaneous. This is what they have all been promised. In the Torah, the Jews are promised the Lord of hosts and the Messiah. In the Gospel, the return of Christ and Elijah is foretold. In the religion of Muhammad, there is the promise of the Mahdi and the Messiah. The same holds true of the Zoroastrians and others. But to belabor this matter would prolong our discourse. Our meaning is that all have been promised the advent of two successive manifestations. It has been prophesied that through these twin manifestations, the earth will become another earth. All existence will be renewed. The contingent world will be clothed with the robe of a new life. Justice and righteousness will encompass the globe. Hatred and enmity will disappear. whatever is the cause of division among people, races, and nations will be obliterated. And that which ensures unity, harmony, and concord will be promoted. The heedless will arise from their slumber. The blind will see. The deaf will hear. The dumb will speak. The sick will be healed. The dead will be quickened. And war will give way to peace. Enmity will be transmuted into love. The root causes of contention and strife will be eliminated. Mankind will attain true felicity. This world will mirror forth the heavenly kingdom, and the earth below will become the throne of the realm above. All nations will become one nation. All religions will become one religion. All mankind will become one family and one kindred. All the regions of the earth will become as one racial, national, personal, linguistic, and political prejudices will be effaced and extinguished, and all will attain everlasting life under the shadow of the Lord of hosts. Now one must prove the advent of these twin manifestations by reference to the sacred scriptures and by inference from the sayings of the prophets. For our intention now is to provide arguments drawn from the sacred scriptures, since rational arguments establishing the truth of these two messengers were presented at table a few days ago. The book of Daniel fixes the period between the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the martyrdom of Christ at 70 weeks. For it is through the martyrdom of Christ that the sacrifice is ended and the altar destroyed. This prophecy thus refers to the advent of Christ. These 70 weeks begin with the restoration and rebuilding of Jerusalem, concerning which 4 edicts were issued by 3 kings. The first was by Cyrus in 536 BC, and this is recorded in the first chapter of the book of Ezra. The second edict regarding the rebuilding of Jerusalem was issued by Darius of Persia in 519 BC, and this is recorded in the 6th chapter of Ezra. The third was issued by Artaxerxes in the 7th year of his reign, that is, in 457 BC, and this is recorded in the 7th chapter of Ezra. The fourth edict was issued by Artaxerxes in 444 BC, and this is recorded in the 2nd chapter of Nehemiah. What Daniel intended is the third edict, which was issued in 457 BC. 70 weeks makes 490 days. Each day, according to the text of the Bible, is 1 year. For in the Torah it is said, "The day of the Lord is 1 year." Therefore, 490 days is 490 years. The third edict of Artaxerxes was issued 457 years before the birth of Christ, and Christ was 33 years old at the time of his martyrdom and ascension. 33 added to 457 is 490, which is the time announced by Daniel for the advent of Christ. But in Daniel 9:25, this is expressed in another manner. That is, as 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which outwardly differs from the first statement. Many have been at a loss to reconcile these two statements. How can reference be made to 70 weeks in one place and 62 weeks and 7 weeks in another? These two statements do not accord. In reality, Daniel is referring to two different dates. One begins with the edict Artaxerxes issued to Ezra to rebuild Jerusalem and corresponds to the 70 weeks which came to an end with the ascension of Christ, when sacrifice and oblation were ended through his martyrdom. The second begins after the completion of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, which is 62 weeks until the ascension of Christ. The rebuilding of Jerusalem took 7 weeks, which is equivalent to 49 years. 7 weeks added to 62 weeks makes 69 weeks. And in the last week, the ascension of Christ took place. This completes the 70 weeks, and no contradiction remains. Now that the advent of Christ has been proven through the prophecies of Daniel, let us establish the advent of Baha'u'llah and of the Bab. So far, we have only provided rational arguments. Let us now turn to traditional ones. In Daniel 8:13, it is said, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Until it says, At the time of the end shall be the vision. That is to say, how long shall this misfortune, this ruin, this abasement and degradation endure? Or when will the morn of revelation dawn? Then he said, 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Briefly, the point is that he fixes a period of 2,300 years, for according to the text of the Torah, each day is 1 year. Therefore, from the date of the edict of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem until the day of the birth of Christ, there are 456 years. And from the birth of Christ until the advent of the Bab, there are 1,844 years. And if 456 years are added to this number, it makes 2,300 years. That is to say, the fulfillment of the vision of Daniel took place in 1844. And this is the year of the advent of the Bab. Examine the text of the book of Daniel and observe how clearly he fixes the year of his advent. There could indeed be no clearer prophecy for a manifestation than this. In Matthew 24:3, Christ clearly says that what Daniel meant by this prophecy was the date of the advent, and this is the verse. As he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Among the words he uttered in reply were the following: When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Thus he referred them to the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, implying that whoever reads it should grasp when the time shall be. Consider how clearly the advent of the Bab has been specified in the Torah and the Gospel. Let us now establish the dates of the advent of Baha'u'llah from the Torah. This date is calculated in lunar years from the revelation of the mission and emigration of Muhammad. For in the religion of Muhammad, the lunar calendar is used, and all the ordinances regarding religious observances have been expressed in terms of that calendar. In Daniel 12:6, it is said, "And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished." As I have already explained the meaning of day, no further explanation is needed. But let me briefly say that each day of the Father is equivalent to 1 year, and each year consists of 12 months. Thus, 3.5 years makes 42 months, and 42 months is 1,260 days. And each day in the Bible is equivalent to 1 year. And it is in the very year 1260 from the emigration of Muhammad, according to the Muslim calendar, that the Bab, the herald of Baha'u'llah, revealed his mission. Afterwards, in verses 11 and 12, it is said, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate be set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days." The commencement of this lunar reckoning is from the day of the proclamation of the prophethood of Muhammad in the land of Hijaz, and that was 3 years after the revelation of his mission, because in the beginning the prophethood of Muhammad was concealed, and no one knew of it save Khadijah and Ibn Nawfal until it was publicly announced 3 years later. And it was in the year 1290 from the proclamation of the mission of Muhammad that Baha'u'llah announced his revelation. So that is chapter 10, ladies and gentlemen. As you see, it's a very simple chapter for some people. For others, it's a bit more involved, and I am in the latter camp. It has taken me a bit of time to try and read and reread over this. But let's take this on together, and I'm sure many of you will have great insight into this. So this is chapter 10, Traditional Proofs and Traditional Arguments from the Sacred Scriptures. Now, Abdu'l-Baha is saying that quite clearly we could look at miracles, but miracles are only a proof for those who witnessed them. Was it sorcery? Was it some form of magic that had taken place? Well, maybe, maybe not, who knows? So that isn't strong enough for someone to just look at that. Clearly, if someone were to look at the fact that Baha'u'llah's message, that the Bab's message, had spread across the globe despite their imprisonment, their persecution, well, that should really be truth enough. If people were to really look at this themselves and see what had happened, then they would completely and utterly understand what has taken place. He also says that if somebody were to reset themselves to 0 and not be attached to love or hate, so this includes love, then one would be able to really find their truth. Now, we must understand that whilst this is taking place, that Abdu'l-Baha is speaking to Laura Barney, and she is a Christian, and she, of course, would have been aware of these subjects, of these discussions, and that's what he is addressing. And there's no way I can expound really any further than what Abdu'l-Baha has done, or come close to it, but I will try and break down some of the things, some of the background that may be needed to understand some of these things. Some proofs are based on scripture, these traditional arguments. Rational proofs are things such as ideas of spring, summer, and autumn come around, and renewal that humans need is likewise very similar indeed. Now, we are talking about these temples that are being built. One of the things mentioned is the term the abomination of desolation. Now, the abomination of desolation, well, what is that? Well, we need some understanding because this is mentioned in Daniel 9. This is a very important thing that we have to try and understand. I'm sure many of you have a great understanding of the Holy Bible, but the Bible effectively has 66 sections. There are 27 parts of the New Testament and 39 in the Old Testament. And the New Testament covers maybe some 60 to 70 years, whereas the Old Testament, these 39 books, they cover centuries. And these 39 come under the umbrella of Abraham and Moses. And that's what we're going to be looking at. And these first 5 books of the Old Testament, this is the Pentateuch. After that, we had Joshua and then some holy people who wrote historical events and other things such as Samuel, David, who's responsible for Psalms, or King Solomon, Proverbs. There's even a book called the Song of Songs, which is very mystical about Jesus and church and God and Israel, depending on how you see it. Then comes the book of Isaiah, which is a long book about prophecy. And Baha'u'llah in the tablets to the kings and rulers says, I am the one that the tongue of Isaiah spoke. And then Jeremiah is also a big book of prophecy, which Baha'u'llah says to us to go and look at Jeremiah. It's in Ezekiel that speaks about this 1 day equals 1 year. The term abomination appears more than 100 times in the Old Testament and just a few times in the New Testament. And an abomination is normally a great sin, commonly worthy of death, but more often throughout the Bible, abomination refers to major covenant violations, especially idolatry. And in the historical books, abomination always describes idolatry, often with a child sacrifice, but also refers to idolatry in the prophets. And we can see in Daniel 9 and 11, there is always this term that's used, sigus, which is in connection with idolatry. So having idols was an abomination. It was a complete and utter abomination. And Daniel, in his prophetic work, refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, along with its temple and sacrifices. And he speaks about this abomination in connection with the temple, saying that finally they shall set up the abomination that maketh desolate. So desolate means to have absolutely nothing or completely destroyed. So this is what the abomination of desolation is, as I understand it, is where in the temple they would not have idols at all. This was completely horrific. It was against the covenant to them, but this was going to take place. And sure enough, it did. There were different things that had been taking place, and here you can see a model of this first Jewish temple. So according to Jewish tradition, the Temple of Solomon, also known as the First Temple, was built by King Solomon in around 990 to 931. Long ago, on the spot where God created Adam, the first man, but the building was destroyed. And this is what this all circles around, the destroying of this building that had taken place. And this building was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylonia. See, what happens is the Jews' land is taken over, essentially. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia removed the temple treasures in 604 BC and in 597 BC, and then totally destroyed this temple in 587, 586. And this temple was an incredibly special place. This is where certain sacrifices would take place. There'd be at least a sacrifice a day, if not 2 or more, that would take place in the temple. And it's very different to a synagogue, completely different thing. Now, the destruction took place and the deportation of Jews to Babylonia in 586 and 582 were seen as fulfillments of prophecy, and therefore strengthened the Judaic religious belief and awakened the hope for the re-establishment of the independent Jewish state. So this is something that was spoken about in the Old Testament. Then we have different invasions that take place of this Holy Land, and one of them was by the Persians. Cyrus, or Cyrus II, if you want to say it in English, He was the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty of Persia and conqueror of Babylonia in 538. He issued an order allowing exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, to be completed in 515 BC. Now, there is no known detailed plan of the second temple which was constructed. It was Artaxerxes in the year 457 when the rebuilding of this temple was going to be taking place again. So that is what this prophecy of Daniel is referring to. So you had this temple and it was destroyed, and the Jews were essentially kicked out of the land and they weren't allowed to come back. The sacrifices weren't able to take place. And there were countless idols that were in the temple. And this was the abomination of desolation. Now, why is all of this important? Well, it's important because of these prophecies of Daniel, who speaks about what is going to take place. We know, again, from Ezekiel, as I mentioned, the day of the Lord is 1 year. So one day represents 1 year. And he speaks about the 70 weeks. So 70 weeks is what? I'm sure there are many good mathematicians there. 70 weeks. In 1 week, we have 7 days. So that's 70 times 7, which is 490. And this is a prophecy that the Anointed One will come for the Jews, and he will be the Messiah. He will be martyred 70 weeks later. So if we look at this diagram, which originally was put together by someone called William Miller, who was the head of the Millerites, and he had, looking at the prophecies of Daniel, had seen that 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. So this 490 years was to take place. And when we take it from when the edict was given, the 457, when we add 490 years to that, we then come to 34 AD, when His Holiness Christ ascended. So there we have that prophecy that is fulfilled. And there's also this other prophecy about that takes place once the temple was rebuilt. And we're told that the temple took 49 years to rebuild. So 49 years, how many weeks is that? 7 times 7 is 49. So it's 7 weeks, because there's 7 days in a week. And that's when in 408 BC, the temple was rebuilt. So one prophecy starts from when the edict was given, 457. Another one starts from when the temple was rebuilt. And we can look at this map, these 69 weeks and another week for the passing of Christ to take place. So Abdu'l-Baha is speaking about these. Now, we don't necessarily need to go too into detail about these things, and maybe I already have done. I do apologize, but I wanted to give some background to it. Remember, Abdu'l-Baha is speaking to Laura, and she is well-versed in these Christian scriptures. In fact, Christ is asked when he'll be crucified, and in Matthew it speaks to this, Matthew 24, and he says, if you want to know more about my return, remember, His Holiness Christ came, the Messiah, as far as Baha'is believe, and then he would return again. So he says, if you want to know about my return, you'll see more details in Daniel, and it's in this prophecy of Daniel, where it speaks about 2,300 days. So there's this prophecy, again, that in 2,300 days, Christ will return. We can refer back to the text. It says, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? So how long will this desolation take place? When will the sanctuary be cleansed? And the sanctuary is the inner part of the temple. When will the Holy Land really shine resplendent with holiness, essentially? And this is what we are looking at, where it speaks about this 2,300 days, which we understand to be 2,300 years, because, again, according to the text of the Torah, each day is a year. And I believe it says that in Ezekiel. The edict to rebuild this church started in 457, as we can see here on our graphic, and there would be 2,300 years. Now, very interestingly enough, as we look through this, we will take the year, remember it's minus, because it's before Christ, BC, minus 457 plus 2,300. What number does that give us? You've all guessed it, or you haven't, 1843. Now, 1843 is a problem. People were very confused because they thought, well, this should come to 1843. As far as Baha'i prophecies come, well, that doesn't mean anything. Nothing particularly really happened in the year 1843. But of course, those people who are superb at maths will recognize that we haven't accounted for the year zero. And the year zero also counts as a year, which then takes us to the year 1844. And then that's how that is arrived at. So it's quite fascinating, again, when we look at this prophecy that is there, when you add the 2,300 years that we are looking at, we see this takes us to 1844. And of course, it was in 1844 that His Holiness the Bab had declared his mission. So again, Abdu'l-Baha is explaining these things. He's going through, breaking it down just for Laura Dreyfus Barney to understand exactly what is going on. Another thing here again, there's this prophecy in Daniel. He has a vision of these two individuals speaking, and he hears about this time that is described for a time, times, and a half. Now, this seems very confusing. What is a time, times, and a half? Well, if one were to take time to be understood as 1 year, and then times as 2 year, because it's plural, and then a half, you have 1 year plus 2 years plus a half year, which gives us this 3.5 years. And 3.5 years, well, 3 years is how many months? 3 times 12, which is 36, plus another 6, which is half a year, is 42 months. I do apologize. My mum is a maths teacher, so maybe I go into maths, lean on maths a little bit too much. But this is what this is all talking about. And the year 1260. Many of you are fully aware what the year 1260 is referring to. This is using the lunar years of the Hijra calendar of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. That also, the year 1260 in Islam, is a reference to the year 1844. So quite remarkable looking at that calendar. And then we'll see here in paragraph 21, the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, the abomination that maketh desolation be set up. There shall be 1,290 days. So what is 1,290 days? Well, that is the year 1290 in the Islamic calendar. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, declared his mission 10 years before Hijrah started, his move from Mecca to Medina. So if you take 10 years off 1290 from the point where he declared, that gives you 1280, and 1280 is the year 1863. And I'm sure you're all aware, it was in 1863 that His Holiness Baha'u'llah declared his mission publicly. It was in 1853, 1290 if you want to look, that he had this interaction with the Maid of Heaven in the Siyar Chal. Again, we don't need to get too stuck up in these numbers. That's not the purpose. We could spend an incredible amount of time going into some of these prophecies, but it's to give us an overall flavor of what Abdu'l-Baha is speaking about. There's also another one that's very interesting, and this is all to do with the year 1335. And again, you see at the bottom here, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. So what happened in 1335? Well, utterly confusing. And you could look at this many different ways, and Baha'i scholars have looked at it in a number of different manners. But one way in which we can look at this is seeing what happened in Islam in the year 628, why it was so important. And this is when the Muslims attempted to perform a lesser pilgrimage in Umrah. And after much negotiations, they entered into a peace treaty with the Quraysh, who had been battling with the Muslims. And this treaty also gave the Prophet the assurance of not being attacked or by the Meccans during their pilgrimage. So if we were to take the date 628 and add 1335, we get to the year 1963, which of course is when the Universal House of Justice was first elected. Now again, these prophecies, as Abdu'l-Baha himself says, these are not really the real proof when we look at things. The word of Baha'u'llah, the word of the Bab, the revelation is the actual proof. And these are just some things that Abdu'l-Baha is speaking to Laura Clifford Barney And he's mentioning these various things because these prophecies are there. They run very, very deep indeed. If not, ladies and gentlemen, it either means that I have sent you all to sleep, utterly confused you, or you've understood, or perhaps you knew already.